O God, take my lips and speak through them. Take our minds and think through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire. Take our hands and feet and serve through them. And take our wills and bend them according to your purpose. Amen.
Amen.
I think one of the greatest anxieties we have in the litany of our fears is that you and I are stuck with ourselves. That is, when we look into the mirror and we probe the depths of our being, many of us would like to make some changes. How about you? Would you like to make some changes to look differently, possibly? Thinner, younger, different hair texture, different outlook on your life. Some of us would like to become more organized or get our finances in order. All of us, I think, could say we want the change of the coronavirus, and we'd like more racial harmony in our society, less racism, more mutuality and respect. The marketing agencies of all of the companies in America know that you and I are going through these thoughts when we look at ourselves in the mirror. They're already tinkering with their advertisements. I got a number of them this past month. I've been writing them down from my junk mail box. One of them wrote, "Boost your portfolio now." That's assuming that we have a portfolio to boost. "Get rich at home." They must have understood that a lot of us are now at home. One of them wrote in an ad, "Find love in Prague." I've been to Prague. I don't think there's any more love to be found there, by the way. "Watch unwanted pounds melt away." They must know that we've been eating our way through our house and home during isolation. And this one was the funniest one. "You can be ordained this week." The ad agencies in our culture know that you and I would like to make some changes. And then we come to church and we also wonder, is the gospel going to do something for me? Is God going to change my life? When Jesus comes into my life, into my soul, is there change possible? We say, beginning in baptism, of course, oh yes. Change is quite possible, but not in the way that you and I expect it. A number of years ago, I took a parish pilgrimage to the Northwest. One of the tours that we took was to the salmon ladders, and we learned from marine biologists there about the incredible transformation that happens from river salmon when they're spawned until they reach the Pacific Ocean. And we were taught a new word during that process of the journey from spawning to the Pacific. It's called smoltification. I'll say it again, smoltification. I had never heard that word. I asked the marine biologist what that means. It is the process that a young salmon goes through, that once the young salmon is spawned, they spend a number of months taking care of and protecting their little area of the bottom of the river. They call them then bottom feeders. They're very protectionist. They're very isolated. They're in the bottom of the river, and they're just fine living their life there on their own by themselves with no company. They don't want any company. In fact, they will fight for their little area of that little bottom of the river. And then something comes over them, the marine biologist taught me. They come into an unawareness, you might say, and they want to be something more than that. And so they begin to then leave their bottom feeder place, their protectionism, and they begin to venture out towards the Pacific. On the way, they go through smoltification. That is a literal change in their nature. Their scales change. Their whole sense, their color changes. Their gills open up bigger and wider so they can take in then the salt water of the Pacific. Their eyes become more focused on a larger vista, to where when they get to the Pacific, which is their purpose, their destiny, you might say, they are prepared for a much larger and much diverse world in that large ocean. Well, you can imagine then, as a priest, I've heard the story from the marine biologist. It sounds so much like baptism, doesn't it? You and I are born into self-interest and self-service. We are born into sort of an isolationism. It's mine, I protect it. Baptism begins to open us up, or it's intended to at least, to give us a wider vista so that we can be prepared then as Christian people, as followers of Jesus, to be part of a larger world of diversity and the different colors and textures of God's bountiful creation. Smultification, or what we might say in baptism, transformation. It's to be given a transforming grace where we can change from just aloneness and isolation and protectionism into something much more wonderful. The Apostle Paul talks about that in our epistle text, assigned for this week. Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means, he writes to the Romans. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Do you not know that all of us who've been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, we were buried with him in his death, but were given new life in his resurrection. This grace, we say about baptismal transformation, changes us, gives us places to go that we didn't expect to go, gives us relationships and experiences that we otherwise would not have received. When I was a boy growing up, I grew up in a medium-sized Episcopal church about an hour south of here. I was baptized in that church. I was confirmed at 12 in that church. I was in the youth group. I was an acolyte. So much of my baptismal formation happened at Emmanuel Church. But as I was growing up, I also remembered these little whispers that would happen. What are we going to do if some of them come? Where will we seat them if some of them come? Will we seat them in the back or the balcony? Will we be welcoming if some of them come? I can still remember the whispers about these people who might show up at our church. It was about the same time of that whispering that I was invited to be a counselor in training at a wonderful YMCA camp, Camp Weewa. Some of you may know that, some of you Floridians. And in those days, I remembered that it was segregated. No African Americans allowed at Camp Weewa, only us with lighter skin. But I didn't know that year they made a tremendous decision. The board of directors decided to integrate Camp Weewa. I went to my counselor and training program just excited. I had my duffel bag. I got there early. I went in to check in, got all my information about my cabin. 2 people per cabin, I was told. I walked into my cabin, and there was the other cabin mate already with his stuff on his bed. He was about my height. He was about my age, and he was African American. Now, I had been taught all of my social graces, knowing what to say, what not to say. I've been taught by some of my upbringing to treat everyone with kindness and respect, but I was actually quite taken aback. We went to dinner, I can remember. And then after dinner, we had some training sessions, and then we were all invited to go back to our cabin for the night, get some good sleep. We have a big day tomorrow, we were told. We went back to our cabin. My cabin mate was named Gilbert. He sat on his bed, I sat on my bed, we began to talk. Hesitantly at first, I remember. We talked about sports, football and baseball. We both played those sports. And we talked about girls. I remember that we were both scared of them. We found that we liked the same music, Motown. We discussed our faith. He was Baptist. I was Episcopalian. We discovered that we were from the same city. But as Gilbert talked about his neighborhood in the same city, it did not sound at all like my neighborhood. It felt like we were from two different worlds. We talked most of the night. I can remember going to bed in the wee hours of the morning. And I remember waking up that Saturday morning, and I was changed. Thanks to Gilbert, I had received smoltification, at least some of it anyway. I had come in just as a mere white boy, 13 years old, from my neck of the woods in my own vista with my own worldview. And thank God, Gilbert was my cabin mate. He began to open up, you see, my gills so that I could receive a larger world, a more diverse world, a world where you and I look into different kinds of people and we see glimpses of God. I had received some measure of smoltification. So what is the ingredient? What's the primary ingredient that goes into you and I asking for and receiving the gift of smoltification? I believe that one of the ingredients is courage. I don't mean white-knuckle tough courage like John Wayne. I'm talking about a courage that allows ourselves to change, that looks into the mirror and says, I'd like to make a few transitions. I'd like to think differently. I'd like to feel differently. I'd like to act with some change in my life. It takes courage to let down our guard, you see, and to open up and be honest with ourselves about our prejudices, about some narrow view, about some group of people, about some vista you and I hold on to. It's a gift from God, this courage. This courage which is from the heart. You may know that in the French, coeur means of the heart. It's where our passion resides. This kind of courage is not just thin. It's not just checking the box and saying we've been there. This is the kind of courage that receives the gift of baptism, of smoltification, and allows it to do its work. Last month, by a friend's urging, I listened to an old song by Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel. It's got an unusual name. He Was a Most Peculiar Man is the name of the song. He wrote it in 1967, I learned. I looked it up. He wrote it while he was in London in a lobby of a hotel, and he happened to flip open the London Times and happened to flip to the obituary. There were just 4 lines there about a man. He was a most peculiar man. That's what Mrs. Royden said. As she should know, she lived upstairs from him. She said he was a most peculiar man. That song caused me to remember a most peculiar man who was in my very first church when I was a rector. His name was Leo. When I got to know Leo was older. He was already retired. I learned in visiting with Leo that he was a civil engineer. He was very bright, MIT, built bridges all over the world. And yet he didn't have anyone in his life. He was alone a lot. I would see him once or twice a month, have Eucharist in his home. He was not particularly well then. Meals on Wheels would come a couple times a week. I remember one day Leo beginning to tell me his story. Leo, who happened to be African American, told me how difficult his life had been because he was the only African American man ever in his schoolhouse, in his undergraduate program, in his graduate program, in his business. He was the only black man who was a civil engineer anywhere near his sphere of living. He told me how tough it was to be an African American man, how people would follow him around, be suspicious of him. You've heard these stories. Several times later, after Leo began to trust me more as we were having Eucharist together, he revealed to me that he was also gay. He told me sadly, tears rolling down his face, that he had been disowned by his own family. He revealed to them when he was a young man that he was attracted to men. He told them also that he was leaving the Baptist church where he grew up, and he was joining the Episcopal church. They told him, never come home. Never. He was kind. He was brilliant. He was special. He was a most peculiar man. He wasn't brave necessarily because he was African American. He didn't have courage necessarily because he was gay. He was courageous because he lived in a society where he was disowned as an African American male and as a gay man. Several weeks after his death and his funeral, where a few people came, I received a notice from his attorney. He had written a note before his death to the rector, me. He said, I want to leave you the antique table that we used to use for our Eucharist. It still resides in our house here in Jacksonville, Leo's table. I also learned from his attorney that he had given away massive wealth, half of it to AIDS research and half of it to the homeless shelter of Iredell County, North Carolina. Leo had gone through smultification. He had looked into the mirror and seen a child of God, one who could make a difference, not only in building bridges, but in being God's child, witnessing to the great love of God. He was a most peculiar man, but he was a brave soul. What about you? What about me? Would you like to make some changes in your life? Beginning in baptism, we can hear God's voice say, oh, yes. Oh, yes, you can make some changes, but those changes are not going to be quite exactly what you expect. I'm going to take you to places you don't expect to go and give you people you don't expect to meet and be with. Jesus concludes the gospel text for this week. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of my world, they will find it. Amen. Amen.